The clear blue sky, vivid, cloudless, and bright, only served to provide a sense of false security. I peered over the broad horizon. The intoxication of the night before only added to my buzz. The weather couldn't possibly be better. I nodded to Aaron. "Good morning, numb nuts," I said with excitement and a hint of concealed anxiety. "Good morning, dildo breath," he yelled back. I ignored his vulgarity and continued to take it all in. I was a sight for the eyes to behold, a picture-perfect late summer day. "Is this what you call an adventure day?" I asked, trying to conceal my ever-increasing anxiety. "This is what I call summit day," was his reply. He was busy fussing with the ropes and climbing gear with an intense look of sheer determination on his face. I wasn't too concerned with the conversation. I was too busy taking it all in. I was far more concerned with the pristine beauty that surrounded our campsite. It was all too surreal. Vibrant and green vegetation gracefully added to the beauty. The cottonwood trees were in a season of change, displaying multicolored leaves, ranging from dark green to amber shades of brown, yellow, and gold. The golden leaves of once before paved the trail before us. Juniper shrubs in shades of bluish-green tones dotted the lower spectrum of the landscape. The scenery, the weather, was all too perfect. That was perfect for the moment. As fate would have it, a far from perfect day would soon unveil itself. It would be the weather that would transform our destiny. It would play its part in a near-death experience for Aaron and myself. Our goal is to summit Castleton Tower via the classic North Chimney route, a 500-foot tower situated in Castle Valley near Moab, Utah. The name Castle was most likely derived from the domineering rock formations that were scattered along the Central Valley. Many of them resemble castles in appearance. Castles of crimson red iron oxide, rust in color, and majestic in stature. They would be the sentinels that guarded the valley below. They would be the very first thing for the eyes to behold when gazing across the pristine, portrait-like valley. To paint a mental picture of this desert wonderland, I refer back to my childhood on Saturday morning watching cartoons. The Wile E. Coyote Roadrunner show. The desert scene often used in the backdrop of that cartoon could roughly describe the desert environment that surrounded our campground. "This is Redemption Day," I exclaimed. "No, this is Summit Day," Aaron repeated himself for the second time that morning. "Yeah, that's what I just said, why no pressure here," I thought to myself. His footloose, fancy-free attitude to rock climbing was in direct contrast to my safety-first approach. Our mission, as Aaron would have it, would be considered a moderate endeavor with a steep grading curve. Of course, this coming from a person with an extensive record of injuries and tragedy. Nonetheless, I was ready mentally and physically fit from a busy summer of rock climbing and hiking. Like with most mountaineering endeavors, they are best enjoyed when they are completed. That is, they are best enjoyed the night after, sitting at the bar telling the tales of the day's adventure. However, sadly, there would be no stories of bravado in the taverns that night. There would be no telling of tales filled with excitement and adventure. Because for us, fate had a different plan. The scenery came in vivid shades of red sandstone. The slippery sanded slopes of the lower wall were 70 to 80 degrees, making for a difficult evacuation. Finally, after several attempts, we escaped the slippery sanded slopes of the lower canyon wall. Shortly after, the path before us would become increasingly progressive in its difficulty. It would lead into territory considered more advanced in nature. This being especially true as we quickly advanced through numerous sections of Class 3 and 4 hiking terrain. As we approached the tower, the larger it would appear to us. It produced in me a real sense of humility. It was truly a jaw-dropping experience to gaze upon the tower. It was a feeling of excitement and twisted exhilaration. My courage started to spiral in a downward motion, only to be snuffed out rapidly by my ever-increasing ambition. I have been here before, I thought to myself in a vain attempt to conceal my ever-increasing anxiety. This feeling of dread was not new to me. I had felt it before. However, I believe the mind has an amusing way of forgetting pain and fear, and then suddenly remembering when faced with it again. Standing before the massive tower, I remembered well. So no matter how painstakingly I was to prepare for the danger, I would be subjected to factors that I would have no control. On more advanced levels of climbing, the overall climb to the summit may exceed the length of standard climbing ropes, the length of which is either 150 or 200 feet on most standard dynamic ropes. So, because Castelon Tower exceeds the length of our climbing ropes, threefold, the entire climb is divided into a series of stages, or what climbers refer to as pitches. The leader or the lead climbers assumes the majority of the risk involved, so typically the stronger, more experienced climber is the perfect candidate to take the lead on the more advanced routes. It was a little bit of exhaustion, mixed with much excitement, mixed with endorphin-induced euphoria. It was quite enjoyable up to this point. Onward, bound to the tower. Now, exclaimed Aaron. The anxiety was intoxicating. It was an unsettling experience in my conscious perception. When I reflect on it now, I realize that it was a premonition in progress. Finally, we reached the tower. Aaron would take the lead. Aaron, being the stronger climber, he would be the obvious choice to spearhead the expedition. As I briefly touched on before, lead climbing comes at a much higher risk. It comes with a greater potential for equipment failure. If you've ever watched rock climbers in action and wondered, how the hell did they ever get that rope up there? Well, the answer is the lead climber is the one who got it up there. As the leader makes progress, he or she hooks into some sort of protection every 5 to 20 feet, depending on a number of factors. Now let's say you're on the lead of a climb. You were to climb 10 feet above your last point of protection and fall before you could reach your next point of protection. You would fall a total of 20 feet plus rope stretch before the rope catches you. Whatever the situation, it's a pretty frightening when you're leading and you're facing a potential fall. Thankfully, the gear works surprisingly well, and in most cases, the fall is arrested, and when that happens, we call it a lead fall, or a whipper. I personally have experienced 2 good whippers in my climbing career. Severe lead falls do not happen all that often, primarily, because the lead climber will do everything in their power, literally, to avoid taking a big lead fall. Yes, the gear is there and it will protect you in most cases, but again, there are a lot of variables in play and no one wants to test the limits of their equipment. However, I do feel compelled to mention that equipment failure is extremely rare. Yes, it does happen every now and then, and it usually means serious injury and in some cases death. However, it is human failure that prevails on a much more frequent basis, so it is appropriate that the stronger climber assume the grave responsibility of leading the more difficult routes. Once the lead climber finishes the route, he or she sets up a safer top rope for the following climber. Then it is the follower's duty. Clean up the climbing gear as they work their way up to the anchor where the lead climber controls the rope. For them. So Aaron would lead the first 2 pitches like it was child's play for him. He was kicking ass and taking names, so to say. Now the time was upon me. It was my turn to climb. Now it was my job to follow Aaron's lead and clean up the climbing gear that he had used to protect the route. The climbing was extremely difficult for me. It was extremely difficult even with the advantage of climbing on a safer top rope. The first route was sustained at a difficulty of 5.9 plus. This would be my hardest challenge yet. Every move was at least a 5.9, and it demanded tremendous focus, concentration, and endurance to complete. This is of great importance to mention because the classification of sustained makes the route entirely more difficult. It drained all of my reserves and I was relying on pure adrenaline to make the moves as I approached the end of the first route. The second route wouldn't be any easier. In fact, it would be more difficult to complete. I remember thinking to myself, there is no way I can do this. In spite of the fatigue, I kept pushing anyway. It would be my drive to succeed that would win the day. Aaron, being the stronger climber, excelled through the first 2 pitches, in fact, making it look easy. Now finally, I would have my time to shine. It would be my honor to lead the 3rd and final summit pitch. My pre-designated route to lead by comparison was very easy, with only 1 move reaching the difficulty of 5.8, the rest of the moves being 5.6 or less. The rest of the route from here would be much easier to complete. This was the farthest I had ever made it. This was not my first try. We had made our first attempt earlier that summer. It was when I had returned to Utah for legal reasons, or more precisely, illegal reasons. I was in Utah to attend a court date for the possession of drugs, specifically marijuana. So right from the get-go, I was highly anxious, this being a primary factor to me, insisting to retreat around halfway up the tower. Now we were back armed with the veracity and a driving force for victory. That, and what I felt was a slight measure of peer pressure. After all, it was Aaron's birthday, and I wanted to have a successful climb to celebrate it. Furthermore, we had failed on the last try, and I didn't want to return home defeated again. Maybe just simply for the bragging rights and a good story to share with friends. For whatever the reason, I was determined. This time, we would not accept defeat. My previous best just would not do anymore. Now was the time to excel. My inner instinct was telling me to turn back. However, I would not listen. Instead, I concentrated my fear into focus. I did in fact make my fear work for my benefit. Now, before I get any further into my story, there is a point I would like to drive home. That is, we were climbing in a rock formation known to rock climbers as a chimney. It's just like it sounds, but only one difference. A traditional chimney on a house has 4 sides, whereas a chimney on a rock formation has only 3, and the open side was to our backs. So we could not see the rapidly changing weather. As we slowly made progress on the climbing route, this important factor soon became reality. Nonetheless, it truly was my time to shine. The third and final pitch would be my lead. If not for the bad weather, it would have been the highlight of my life. This feeling of euphoria would soon change, as we would soon be catapulted into the grim reality of grave danger. This was also around the time we had received our first glimpse of the ominous weather looming over our heads. After that initial glimpse of the sky, I said, "What the fuck?" as I looked back to Aaron. His response, "Dude, we are screwed." Those words coming from Aaron sent a sort of shock through my nervous system, because Aaron always is the one to downplay the true gravity of any serious predicament. And through the many adventures that we had experienced together, he would always minimize the true danger in any given situation. That cloudless sky from a mere 2 hours earlier had transformed into a recipe for disaster. I had stopped shy of a few easy moves to the summit. Because Aaron had led the majority of the tower, and the fact that it was his birthday, I felt it would be appropriate to let him have the honor of being the first to reach the top, and the first, he would be the summit at last. However exhilarating the victory was, it would in fact be short-lived. It looked like a tornado could drop right on top of our heads at any moment. The restless dark clouds were like unstable seas in furious shades of black and gray. I might be tempted to say that it was the most frightening shit that my eyes had ever beheld. It was like a mass of clouds swirling around like a witch's cauldron ready to boil over. There was absolutely no time to enjoy the view from the top of the tower. We needed to set up our ropes for a quick retreat, and we needed to do it fast. Words just can't describe what it felt like to handle our ropes, even for 1 second. It was downright terrifying. If we had a moment to pause and look at each other, I'm sure our hair would have been standing straight up like a soldier standing, at attention for his commanding officer. I had never served in the military or ever fought in a war, but the territory we were about to embark on would be the next closest thing. From this point forward, each minute would progressively become more terrifying than the last. I had just mentioned trying to handle ropes. Now picture this. It was as if the climbing ropes was a nest of pit vipers ready to strike. They were making a terribly loud hissing sound from the overwhelming amount of static electricity in the air. It was as if they were alive. We would lift them just inches off the ground, and then we would instantly recoil in terror just to drop them back onto the ground again. For fuck's sake, we were standing on top a natural lightning rod. Aaron and I were in the middle of a Wrath of God electrical storm, and we were the tallest thing around for miles. If given a choice at the time, I would have rather been handling a nest of living pit vipers. Anything other than those godforsaken climbing ropes. It was utterly inconceivable at the level that words just cannot describe. Dear God, please let this just be a bad dream. Oh, please let me wake up. But as fate would have it, it was not a dream. It was more real than any reality I had ever known, up to this point. We would take our turns trying to handle those ropes. No words or images could give an accurate detail to just how terrifying it was to handle these live wire ropes. I am actually surprised that they were not glowing at the time. We took our turns picking the ropes up and then quickly dropping them. Something had to happen, something had to give. Think, I said to myself. Where was my creative instinct when I needed it most? What a fucked up paradox it was. The one thing meant to save us was going to kill us. There was no choice but to handle them. We absolutely had to use the ropes. It was the only way down. We desperately needed to set the ropes for the multi-pitch rappel to the bottom. A brief but intense argument ensued between Aaron and myself. Aaron wanted to adhere to the guidebook's instructions to rappel down the sheer east-facing cliffs. I argued against the guidebook's advice. I supported a retreat via the north chimney, the way we came up. My logic was that the east-facing wall offered little for protection from the lightning. Aaron's argument was this, that the guidebook stated quite earnestly not to go down the route we had used to get up. We would soon find out why. I now ask myself if Wrath of God thunderstorms were considered by the author when they wrote the guidebook for climbing Castelon Tower. The argument ended abruptly, and I had my way. We would make a hasty retreat against the guidebook's advice via the north chimney. It was settled then, so down the north chimney we would go. About this time, we were literally immersed in a total war zone. Zap, boom, flash, thunder, flash. Thunder report. Repeat. It was like being in an actual war zone. A real fucking war zone, I tell you. Not a war zone of landmines and mortars, but a war zone of lightning and thunder. The way in which we utilized our skill with rope work was second to none. We were forced to be pros with our craft because, quite literally, our lives were dependent on it. It's needless to say it was the best rope work before, then, and to this day. Now try to remember that to simply hold the ropes could be a death sentence at any moment. With calculated speed and precise intent, we set up the first anchor for a hasty retreat. Aaron would have the first go at it. He made it to the first belay station and then yelled for me to follow. Now please, take into account that the climb had to be done in a series of stages, and likewise, the way down also had to be done in a series of stages as well. This being the case because the 500+ foot tower exceeded our longest rope in length threefold. The rappel technique most commonly used consists of the rope being folded in half, thus creating two lines. That way, after the first rappel down was complete, you could simply tug on one of the lines and pull the entire rope down. And then, you could set the rope up for the next rappel down. It would require a total of 3 rappels for us to reach the bottom safely. Now, Aaron's worst fear quickly became a reality, and we would learn firsthand why the guidebook stated quite intently not to do the exact thing we were doing at the time. You know, the little part about not descending down the north chimney. Well, when the time came to retrieve the rope from above to set up for the next rappel, we could not, because the rope was snagged in the cracks above us. "Oh, that's why the guidebook said not to come this way," Aaron muttered, half to himself, but loud enough for me to hear. His voice carried that signature sarcasm he never bothered to hide. Then he turned to me, deadpan. "So now do you see, dumbass, why the guidebook said not to go this way?" He gestured around at our mess of a situation, then added, This exact disaster is what it was warning us about." I threw up my hands. "Okay, well, how was I supposed to know?" He stared at me like I'd just admitted I couldn't read. "Because, idiot, the guidebook literally told us so." There was a pause, tense, awkward. Then his expression softened. He sighed, and his voice dropped. "Look, I'm sorry, man. If we end up dying out here, I'm glad I'm dying with you." Now at this point, things were starting to look pretty hopeless for us. We pulled and yanked again, but to no avail. The ropes were jammed. They weren't going anywhere, and neither were we. All the while, the weather went from bad to downright terrifying. Thunder and lightning popping off everywhere, and quite frequently to boot. Now at this point, it wasn't a matter of if we were going to get hit. It was a matter of when, and we knew it all too well. We were sitting ducks. Our rope retrieval efforts were futile. So we soon adopted a different tactic. We started screaming. We screamed with veracity at the top of our lungs. But our cries for help were useless. They were, but in vain. For no one could hear us from under overwhelming decibels the thunder was creating. Our cries were washed out by the overwhelming sound of the thunder. I thought better yet to just throw myself right off the cliff we were perched on, then face the inevitable. I turned to Aaron and asked, "Is this the worst jam you've ever been in?" He shrugged. "Nothing's even happened yet." "Yeah, that's great," I shot back. "But you and I both know damn well something is going to happen. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when." He looked away, but I kept going. "You're just as scared as I am." "If I were," he said calmly, "I wouldn't tell you." "You don't have to," I replied. "It's written all over your face." A brief moment of silence, and then it happened. Kaboom zap explosion. A bright flash of light with the illumination of 1,000 stars. A roaring freight train screaming an outcry equal to a nuclear blast at point-blank range. This was ground zero. A terrible, earth-shattering boom, my hearing being the least of my worries at the time. We were hit. Quite literally struck by lightning. I have never in all my life experienced something so intense. It was a sensation, more terrifying than all my nightmares combined could ever hope to evoke. This description is my very best effort to recreate in writing the sensation of the hellish terror I had felt that hour. It was the ultimate combination of all 5 human senses screaming for mercy and beyond. To fully understand, one would have to experience it for themselves. I would later find out the impact would leave burn marks on our bodies. The most remarkable aspect of the whole experience was that, physically, it was not painful at all. At least it was not painful as most humans understand pain. Moreover, the real mindfuck was that it wasn't even a direct hit. Later, my best thinking on the subject revealed to us that the electrical current traveled down our wet ropes before making its impact on us. Do you remember that I had mentioned those hissing pit vipers earlier? Well, they finally struck. It was the brightest light I had ever witnessed combined with an ear-shattering roar of thunder. The impact lifted us several inches off our perch. Thank you, Jesus, we were tightly secured to the rock ledge because Aaron had the foresight moments before the impact to tie ourselves into the makeshift anchor we had created. Had he not, I wouldn't be writing about this right now. In the mists of this burning light, I had watched my body explode. Oh, how terrible it was to watch my body being dismantled with this terrible noise and flash of light. I was watching, my arms and legs leave my body in a violent explosion. I could only imagine this is what it must feel like when a soldier steps on a landmine. Or so I thought at the time. It was more like a jarring experience, like if you were to get smacked across the head with a 2x4 but without the physical pain. It just had a stunning effect. Like, have you ever smacked your head real good, like the old saying goes, having your bell rang? Now I will try to describe the sound, on how terrible the sound was. I couldn't distinguish or separate the sound from the mind-body sensation. The mind-body sound sensation was manifest in a series of layers, all happening at the same time. On one hand, there is a deafening buzzing sound that was like a million angry wasps buzzing right by my ears times 1,000. All the while, a sound sensation that penetrated to my very soul. It was like all my 5 human senses going into overload, and it seemed to last forever due to a phenomenon known as time dilation, making seconds seem like hours. All 5 human senses go into overload. I could feel the intense vibration buzzing sensation over my entire body, and it was intense, more intense than the human body was ever intended to experience. It's just so hard to describe in words, but I'm hoping this will give you the general ideal. When you are that close to ground zero, you don't see lightning in the traditional way, like most of us are used to seeing. I mean, you don't see in the form of the iconic lightning bolt that we are used to seeing when we watch a lightning storm from the safety of our home or vehicle. What you do see when it's right on top of you is a great ball of light. It appears more like an explosion at very close range. I think, like most of us would imagine, that you actually see the flash explosion and hear the thunder report at the same time. Obviously, my body didn't actually explode. It was just a hallucination created from these factors. The bright flash of light, the deafening explosion, and that my body was experiencing violent convulsions. I was shaking so bad and uncontrollably. It was like having a grand mal seizure. I just could not stop shaking, and the shaking became convulsions in a fraction of a second, and all factors combined led to the hallucination. And like I had mentioned previously, it did not manifest in the sense of physical pain, but it did hurt, mentally. It hurt so bad mentally that an entire book could be written based solely on the massive amount of mental torment caused by the incident. Even though it wasn't what I believed to be a direct hit, it did in fact leave burn marks on my body. The climbing gear that was fastened to our waist became so hot, white hot in fact, that it did leave burn marks on my abdomen. It was a perfect scar to forever remind me of my near-death experience. A common cliche we hear is that lightning never strikes twice in the same place. However, in our case, the tower we were climbing was a natural lightning rod, and I believe it was placing us well above the odds. We sure in the hell did not want to stick around and find out. But if you remember, we were stuck there, so we had no choice but to stay put for the moment. You couldn't possibly imagine the mental torment of being stagnant after that shit just happened. Finally, by tightly embracing me, Aaron was able to stop the convulsions, and ever so slowly the shaking came to a gradual end. We tried pulling on the ropes once more, but it was useless. So again we tried screaming. We would scream in unison, "Help! Help! For the love of God, someone please help us." But at last our screams fell on deaf ears. It was useless. No one could hear us above the continuous thunder. Any hope of a rescue was a hopeless wish. All we could do was sit and wait for the death blow. We just needed to think. Think of a way out of this God-forsaken death sentence. Our one saving grace was that Aaron had the foresight to suggest that we tie ourselves into the safety lines on our makeshift anchor. Thank God we did tie ourselves in, because when I finally came back to full awareness, I was leaning forward and weighting the safety lines tight, meaning that had we not been securely fastened to the anchor, we would have fallen to our death. It would have been something like a 350-foot fall, face first onto jagged rocks below. I believe a 100% mortality rate on that one. Now, after screaming for what seemed like an eternity, we finally had to face reality that no one was coming to save us. If we were to get out of this one, it was going to be up to us. Now was the moment I really began to question our decision to go against the guidebook's recommendation. But back then, our logic felt sound. Looking back, I think Aaron understood, something I hadn't yet considered, that our ropes could easily get snagged on the descent, potentially rendering them useless. At the time, that possibility hadn't even crossed my mind. So now, the dark walls of despair and hopelessness were closing in on us. I was on the edge of despair, ready to give in to what felt like our inevitable doom. We were stuck, out of options and almost out of hope. Then suddenly Aaron spoke up. He had an idea, an insane one, but it might just give us one last shot at survival. "We're only about a third of the way down," he said. I gave him a look. "Okay, and?" "Maybe," he continued. "There's enough rope hanging beneath us. If we cut the two lines, we might be able to use them for two single-line rappels." I blinked. "You think they'll be long enough?" He shrugged. "Maybe. It's a gamble, but it's all we've got. Each rope would have to be just long enough to get us down in one shot. No backups, no second tries. A total roll of the dice," he added. I looked over the edge, then back at him. My voice came out before I even had time to think. "Well, shit. What the hell else are we gonna do?" I said. "Let's go for it." Then came the million-dollar question from Aaron. "So, you got a knife?" I stared at him. "What the fuck? No. You don't have one?" He grimaced. "Left it in the truck when we were scraping our pipe last night." I exploded. "Oh, that's just fucking great. We're gonna die up here because we're such goddamn dope fiends we had to scrape resin out of our pipes like desperate teenagers." To be fair, it had been a dry season for weed, so in retrospect, I guess I wasn't even surprised. Almost. Every one of our adventures had featured the familiar company of our good friend Mary Jane. Honestly, most climbers wouldn't even bat an eye. There are plenty of stoners in the climbing community. But back to the problem. No knife. No way to cut the ropes. We were completely screwed. Then Aaron perked up. Wait, what if we burn through the rope with a lighter? I paused. Crazy? Maybe. But it was something. And honestly, at that point I was just relieved we weren't crackheads, because crackheads blow through lighters like monkeys go through bananas. Luckily, we weren't that far gone. Our lighter still had about half a tank of fuel. In hindsight, if it came down to it, I would have stripped off my shirt and lit it on fire to burn through the ropes if I had to. We were high on a tower, low on options, and somehow still clinging to the hope that sheer desperation might just get us down alive. What a tedious and scary thing it was. It took the better part of an hour to burn through the 2 lines that were dangling beneath us. It's important to remember that the climbing ropes were still hissing and popping from the static electricity in the air. That is, it still posed quite a threat to handle those live wire ropes. We would take our turns burning through each line. I remember holding on to that little red lever on the disposable Bic lighter, on please God don't let this lighter run out on me. It was tedious, terrifying, and downright painful, because to keep a lighter lit that long generates a great amount of heat, and it was burning the shit out of my thumb. Finally, after some time, we enjoyed a small victory. Both lines had been burned through. Now we could only pray that the ropes would be long enough to get us to the bottom. Not just once, but twice. Aaron would be the first to rappel and thank you. Jesus, the first line we had created, would be sufficient to reach the next belay station. I would soon face my next grave challenge when it became my turn to rappel. The final obstacle, though, was terrifyingly personal. My arms wouldn't work. Not properly, anyway. The lightning strike had overwhelmed my body with electricity, and the after effects were brutal. My muscles were locking up. It felt like some kind of cardiovascular paralysis, something I later learned can be a precursor to a heart attack. Not that I was surprised, really. I had just been struck by lightning. Every time I tried to prepare for the next rappel, my arms curled inward involuntarily, seizing into a fetal-like position. It was terrifying. I wasn't exaggerating when I said I remember it like it's happening right now. I can still smell the burning flesh, still feel the erratic twitch of nerves firing uncontrollably under my skin. I kept trying to straighten, one arm only for the other to lock up. It was like getting 2 full-blown Charlie horses, one in each arm, alternating back and forth. I'd fight to stretch one out, then feel the other seize just as hard. The pain was sharp, exhausting, and relentless. To make matters worse, Aaron was already waiting at the next belay station below, completely out of reach. There was no one to help me, but after several desperate, trembling attempts, I finally regained just enough control, just enough to grab the rope and lower myself down. Somehow, through a combination of pain, panic, and pure survival instinct, I made it to Aaron. I slid down that godforsaking rope so fast that I burned the skin on my fingers almost to the bone. It was rope burn as a natural consequence of rappelling my ass off. I made the anchor, and thank God by that time Aaron had ascended to the bottom. Now there was only one more rappel for me to successfully reach the bottom where Aaron was waiting, for me and relative safety. I grimaced at the thought of more rope burn, but I thought, what the hell? I had so much adrenaline pumping through my body that I wasn't going to feel the pain anyways. Moreover, the scar would serve as a grave. Reminder of mountaineering rule number 2, that is, to be off all summits by noon. We had failed miserably at that one. The next climbing party to follow would have probably had their jaws to the ground when they saw all the climbing equipment that we had to leave behind. They would see 2 very expensive climbing ropes and other various gear just dangling there unclaimed, and probably be thinking what the hell happened here. Finally, we were off the tower, but not completely out of the woods. The electrical storm was still severe, and we would haul ass down the class 3 and 4 terrain to get to the safety of our truck. Now, after the worst part was over, a terrifying thought came to me. I think this originated from an episode from the original Twilight Zone series, where the main character arrived in town. I believe it was a post-apocalypse scenario, in which the main character arrived in a town that was void of all inhabitants, later to find that the entire world was without a single person other than himself. The thought in my head at the time was, what if I really died up there and I am in fact existing in the afterlife? I feared that I would arrive at the nearest town and that there wouldn't be a living soul there. Kind of creepy, huh? In this delusional line of thinking, Aaron would have to be dead too. Now I feel it's important to mention that this course of thinking was a delusion caused by a massively traumatized mind from a true near-death experience. Sadly, this would go on for years afterwards. My freshly traumatized mind started with the what-if scenarios, that if I had actually died up there. We didn't happen to pass any hikers on the way down, so in retrospect, it was kind of silly in an obsessive-compulsive type of way. The lack of hikers would only mean that they were not as stupid as we were. That is for climbing in this horrible weather despite the actual posted signs that were plentiful along the trail. The signs read, "These towers are natural lightning rods. Be off all summits by noon and turn back at the very first sign of bad weather." Shortly after we had arrived in our vehicle, my prevailing thoughts were like, what if I really died up there? What if my body really did explode? That would mean my eternal soul would be doomed to wander about in the afterlife. If that were to be true, I was pretty sure I was not in heaven, and that, well, it narrows down the options a bit, and in my irrational thinking leaves only one other choice. I would be a vagabond of sorts doomed to wander till the end of time, which of course would never come. So now I'm obsessed with the thought that I would arrive at the nearest town, and there would be no one there. After all, if this was in fact the afterlife, it would only make sense that the town would be deserted. Well, needless to say, when I did arrive in the next town and there were, in fact, people there. It sufficed for some time, but I was far from cured. I was tormented by my very existence, and the torment would progress, I would think. Well, if I could only see my mom face to face, then I would know that I was alive. So you may be wondering how long this nonsense carried on for. Well, it never fully ended, but I am happy to say that now over 25 years have passed. It's only a rare fleeting thought and I quickly recover from it. However, back then I would continue to come up with those what-if scenarios. This process repeated in succession. I would come up with a scenario, satisfy it, and then come up with another psychosis-fueled scenario. It got to the point that it became ridiculous. It continued around the clock for the better part of 2 years. Then finally, the day came when it lost its continuous hold on me. I was sitting quietly in my living room and the thought occurred to me, I haven't wondered if I was alive or not for an entire day. That was the beginning of a slow mental healing process. It was the beginning of the light at the end of the tunnel, so to say. However, during the dark times, the drugs and alcohol served as a catalyst for making me numb. Or one could say that I used drugs to quiet my overactive mind. That is, they worked for a moment in time. This would pertain to the less hard drugs, like weed and booze. However, the time would come that it would take harder drugs to get the numbing sensation I so desperately desired at the time. Moreover, it also required more frequent use as well. The harder the drugs, the harder the come down, and my demons would again torment me in full force. After the hard drugs would wear off, the psychosis would come back with a vengeance. My solution, which really wasn't a solution at all, was to stay wasted around the clock, and when I say wasted, I'm not just talking about weed. Mary Jane was no longer strong enough to numb my aching mind. Methamphetamine would fix that, but only for a moment. Now it was weed and alcohol around the clock, and when I was feeling especially sluggish, methamphetamine would come to the rescue. However, sadly this too was short-lived, because, unfortunately for every up there must be a down. The mixing of alcohol and meth found me at the bottom of the bottle. This combination really landed me on the rocks, or more accurately, under the bridge. Somehow through all this managed to hang on to my job as a restaurant manager, but sadly this too would come to an end. I was eventually fired for coming to work on drugs. It was around this time that I had discovered what sleep paralysis was. I also discovered that it scared the shit out of me. It was quite ironic that at the time, I was living at an apartment complex named Castlewood Estates. The name in itself would send shivers down my back. Believe it or not, at this point, I actually get sober for a short time. My clean and sober run would last just short of 5 months. I had 150 days clean and was working with a sponsor in AA. This new chapter in my novel of nightmares came suddenly and unexpectedly. After a long, hard day of restaurant management, I came home, flopped on my couch, and fell fast asleep. As I was on the verge of unconsciousness, I remembered hearing a loud thumping sound, kind of like the bass of an 808 kick drum on a slamming car stereo system with 12 woofers. They roared in the background as I was drifting into dreamland. I was not fully sure if I was awake or asleep or somewhere in between, and I wasn't sure if the loud bass sound was real or in my imagination. The one thing that I was sure of was that I could not move. It was my first bout with sleep paralysis, undoubtedly brought on by the lightning incident. I say this because it was something I had never experienced before the lightning strike. Needless to say, it really freaked me the hell out. Shortly after that initial sensation, I quickly fell into a deep sleep. I was rapidly transported into a very vivid dream state, more appropriately, a nightmare state. Before I knew it, I was living the terror of being struck by lightning all over again. It really sucked, to say the least. I could not move to save my life, and my entire body was terrorized by a needle and pins-like sensation. I later learned the clinical term for this phenomenon. It's called paresthesia. In my opinion, it's not very pleasant. On top of that, my mind had dug deep into my subconscious and retrieved the most terrifying memory possible. It was that classic 1980s movie with Patrick Swayze and Demi Moore, Ghost. Specifically, it was the scene in the movie where the main antagonist had died and was quickly carried away by the dark shadow like demons, abyss, or God knows where. Wherever it was quite obvious that it was somewhere that nobody wanted to go. So in my nightmare, it was me being carried away to the abyss. I was flying backwards, a reverse Superman maneuver, as I was carried away by those dark entities, basically to hell. Needless to say, it scared the living shit out of me, and I could not sleep for 2 days after that one. In my dream, everything seemed all too real and vivid. I was walking down the sidewalk, and out of the blue, I was struck by lightning, and was quickly ushered to the outer darkness. I could actually feel the heat and smell the burning sulfur, and hear the ear-piercing screams of the lost souls in the lake of fire and brimstone. I still feel sick to my stomach with anxiety when I merely think about it. To be honest, I still question if it was actually a dream or something more real. A warning of sorts, perhaps. Thankfully, nowadays I almost never think about it anymore. Whatever it was, it served its purpose and there is no need to dwell on it. Sadly, back then, my freshly traumatized mind would be subject to consistent sleep disturbances. Fortunately, ever so slowly over time, they would lessen in intensity and frequency, thank God. I guess time does heal all wounds for the most part. Over time, the unsettling effect was watered down little by little. With each occurrence, I would feel negative effects less and less. It eventually came to the point where I could actually sleep right through the disturbances, until one day it stopped completely. I haven't been affected by this phenomenon for the better part of 10 years now. The night terrors gradually evolved into lucid dreaming. One might even say that I find life quite enjoyable at times. I certainly hope that I never have to experience that feeling of being pulled into the outer darkness again. Thanks to the blood and sacrifice of my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, I am happy to say that I won't have to. The end.